Hello everyone and welcome back to Black Blaze Gaming. Dakota here, and I want to start out by saying thank you to everybody who left feedback on the last video. It was really gratifying to read through all of your comments and get other perspectives on where ESO is right now and all that sort of thing. A major goal for the video was to contribute to an ongoing conversation about the direction that ESO is headed and get those other opinions on my perspective as well as your own perspectives on the game's state and current direction. I'm super pleased that the video resonated with so many of you, and reading the comments was, for the most part, very enjoyable. I thank you so much for not just crucifying me wholesale. I also pinned a comment on the last video that really made me laugh, so go check that out if you get the chance. It's just really funny to me how much of a meme being stuck in combat has become in the community. So as thorough as I tried to be with that video, I do feel some things were either left out or not properly explained, so I'm here now to fix that issue as best as I can. First of all, I want to address the few comments that did make me a bit sad. There were a few people who really just wanted a chance to trash the game without offering anything useful to the conversation. A lot of them didn't even seem like they were active players currently. Ultimately, that's going to happen no matter what. And no one can be blamed for just not liking something. I feel like these sorts of people didn't really watch the video to the end, though, and missed out on the sort of hopeful thoughts I posited towards the end. So I wanted to stress once again that I actually love this game. And it's due to that love and passion I have for it that I worry when things start to look bleak, because I really want more people to like this game too. But I just can't defend this game against the many valid criticisms it receives. As far as I'm concerned, this game needs to improve. There is work to be done, and I hope the devs don't keep missing the mark so often. Next, I want to address something that was commented a few times on the last video, but is by no means a new perspective to me. I hear this most often from casual players, and especially from people who play other MMOs with traditional MMO combat. People tell me that light attack weaving, as in animation canceling, is an unintended bug that they decided to keep in and mold the combat system around rather than fix. This concept is the very foundation, in many cases, of people's distrust of ZeniMax, because it sets the precedent that they're incompetent, can't fix a simple bug, and so they alter the existing game to accommodate it and treat it as an intended feature. Now, I'm going to say this as politely as I can, but this idea is fucking ludicrous. I am so tired of this baseless assumption that because light attacks can be animation canceled and still deal damage, but requires skill and practice to maintain, that it must be an error. The moment someone throws this falsehood into any discussion around content, my immediate impulse is to completely disregard their opinions on anything related to ESO's design. Of course, I don't actually do that. I still try to give everyone a fair shake, but they don't make it easy. I'll try to say this very clearly now, so hopefully I won't have to repeat it in the future, but animation canceling is intentional design. Basically, every good action combat game ever has included specific windows in which animations can be interrupted. This practice rose to prominence in fighting games as a way to increase strategic options so that you didn't have to commit to a full attack if you wanted to throw the enemy off, or needed to react to a change in the fight. It was initially an unintended effect in the Street Fighter's programming that allowed players to craft combos if they were clever enough to master it. Due to its popularity and how much it added to the game's experience, future titles in the series were designed around combos and included animation canceling as a feature. It makes control over a fake character with no real weight or physical presence feel more fluid and responsive. This concept was adopted and expanded upon in the 3D action combat design that was revolutionized in the PS2 era with the groundbreaking Devil May Cry, and has been a staple of such games ever since. The way it works behind the scenes is that an animation is cued to play under certain circumstances. Animations all have a preset duration by their very nature, which may be altered under certain conditions. Movement speed is a major example of such a thing. In order for animations to respond to player input and properly display the current status of a character, there have to be transition animations, and oftentimes the developers need to program in the specific windows during which an animation can be interrupted, and then play that queued up transition animation to the next animation. If an animation is tied to a game function, such as walking forward, the game engine needs to be told specifically when to stop the animation so that your character doesn't appear to be sliding or walking in place. In the case of light attacks in ESO, the game needs to know at what point during the animation and after the input is pressed that it needs to register a light attack connecting with a target. An attack being interrupted prior to connecting with a target would normally prevent the attack from firing and triggering all effects associated with it. This can be seen in numerous skill casts if you block or weapon swap before the ability lands, which will prevent an attack from going off, registering a hit, using up your resources, and so forth. This has been true since this game launched. And again, it is intentional combat design. You can dislike the concept all you want, but it is absurd to assume that it was a bug they couldn't fix and just change the entire trajectory of the core combat system's development to accommodate it. Now, it is fair to say that it may not feel or look responsive in some cases, or that it's impossible for an animation cancel to be unintentional, but all the evidence points to this being a core design decision to make a more fluid and engaging game. I think that it is possible the animation cancel was intentional, but the game's combat wasn't initially designed around it at the outset. But even that has a lot of holes in it when you consider just how many skills from the very beginning required you to be light or heavy attacking at least somewhere in your rotation. Another couple comments I got on the last video expressed a certain confusion or otherwise disagreed with my stance that Dragon Knight is a very powerful class right now. I didn't want to bloat the video by going too into detail on my thoughts there, so I'll get a little more specific here. It also didn't help that I was a bit lazy with the clip I used during that segment, just showing some obnoxious DK tank trolling a keep in Cyrodiil. As an avid player of every class, I can say with a fair bit of confidence that it's pretty easy to see just how insane Dragon Knights are in comparison, by reading their skills. I did mention last time that their whip burst damage ability doesn't fall off outside of combat, but to expand on that, it has a timer. But as long as you cast an Ardent Flame ability, doesn't matter if you're in combat or not, you still maintain that passive damage buff, as well as having the burst available for your next fight. Add to that the fact that someone can dodge the skill, but if they do, you don't lose the stacks, and you have a skill that outclasses others of its type. Now let's look at two more absolutely broken skills in the DK kit. First up is Fossilize, a morph of Petrify in the Earthen Heart line, I think. This is a melee range crowd control ability that applies a stun and an immobilize that is unblockable and undodgeable. Of course, melee range means very little in PvP due to server lag causing melee range abilities to hit people that appear a lot farther away than the skill's range, so that doesn't really count as a nerf in my book. You basically have a class that can drain stamina and lock people down on CC immunity cooldown without fail. Yeah, there are other stuns that are either unblockable or undodgeable, but never both, and they tend to have a considerably more apparent telegraph and don't also immobilize you. The next skill I want to address is Corrosive Armor. Fucking Corrosive Armor. Most ultimates are categorized as either offensive or defensive, but Corrosive Armor says fuck it, we ball, and gives you a defensive buff that reduces all individual incoming damage instances to cap out at 3% of your max health, which is of course made meaningless thanks to coagulating blood healing straight through it in one cast. But it also gives you a damage buff that allows all of your direct damage to ignore enemy armor values. Infinite penetration while being virtually unkillable on a class with one of the most broken burst abilities in the game, which is, yes, direct damage. And then couple all of that with the fact that Dragon Knights regain every resource on casting an ultimate, and they become the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free, damage-bursting monster on the battlefield. If you think Dragon Knight isn't overpowered, you have not tried other classes, or maybe you've never tried Dragon Knight. I mean it when I say that the difference is night and day with this class. Full transparency here, I'm not the most skilled PvP player. I know that's obvious, but when I swap to DK on my janky build that I put together myself, I hit way above my weight class without trying. Dragon Knight is an instant substitute for actual skill. People I would have no business being able to match one-on-one get absolutely deleted by my Magicka DK. This was also true prior to the Oakensoul Ring coming out, but that just serves as a testament to how long this class has been on top. Now, I know there was a long time, mainly after the nerf to reflective scales, where DK was just not cutting it. But as it stands right now, it's just absurd. I think in the overall scheme of things, that having a class be functionally invincible in 1v1 encounters while putting out enough damage to kill most other builds outright is fundamentally unhealthy to the game's PvP experience. They are unkillable, but they're also not someone you can ignore because they'll start picking you off one by one. I also got this really great comment that called me out for saying Templars are pathetic, but not mentioning Necromancers. That's actually a really good point, but I do want to explain a bit more on that. In my defense, I am comparing Templars to that time where they were super oppressive, stacking tons of snares and putting out insane damage without trying. I knew so many people back then that didn't main Templar, but went and built Templars so they no longer had to try in PvP. Interestingly, it's not something I see done as much with DK right now. In hindsight, though, it is kind of funny that I neglected to mention Necromancers because doesn't everybody? Necromancers are so laughable in PvP right now that they can safely be ignored in most fights. And that's coming from somebody who isn't very good. I just walk away from them. I kill everybody else because they don't matter. They can't kill me. Update 41, hilariously and quite tragically, misses the mark by about a mile in terms of fixing their many issues. I mean, maybe damage over time status effect builds will be more viable, but then that means that Templar would just rise into popularity because of how readily they counter such things with an in-class purge. I also didn't really talk about Nightblades on the PvP side. Now, Nightblades are undeniably strong, but their strength requires so much sacrifice. Either you sacrifice survivability for damage, or vice versa. High damage Nightblades can still be survivable, don't get me wrong, but you have to be really good at being slippery, so at least there's a skill check there. Of course, there is the clone teleport ability that they have, which is really intuitive and easy to use, but it's not a foolproof counter and foolproof backup plan for being survivable. People see through it all the time and just wait by your clone to kill you the moment you teleport. One of my favorite things to do in PvP is actually to hunt Nightblade gankers, and I can say with a fair degree of confidence that most Nightblade gankers are one detect potion away from being killed. I also say that as somebody who has played a Stealth Blade for a long time and seen it happen to me. The problem I have is we did not need Update 41's Nightblade changes. Any of them, like at all. More tankiness, more damage, and turning concealed weapon into a useless trinket to everyone but I guess Magblades and only in PvP. And even then, like, just abuse that the broken bow proc Magicka morph that for some reason doesn't fall off outside of combat if you're in PvP. Even though the stamina morph does. Yeah, that should be fixed. It was bad enough they took away our Major Berserk from Grim Focus, but then they gave us this unique damage bonus with Concealed Weapon that could stack with Major Berserk. But then they switched it to Major Berserk so it's less useful. And they made it so that you actually have to cast the ability to gain the buff only while you have Major Expedition or from Stealth, but now it's back to being a unique damage bonus, but only for that ability instead of all of your damage, and only upon leaving Stealth, and only for the Magicka morph. Like, tell me more about how much you hate Stamblades. I also love the notion they put forth constantly that sometimes damage production is too easy on certain builds, so they literally go out of their way to make the game less fun to play because you're just managing dot timers and swapping bars, rather than smacking the enemy with your big spammable and your burst. That said, this focus on having 9 million damage over time abilities has made it somewhat easier to be a melee build in some situations, because when you're out of range for your spammable, you can at least still have your dots up most of the time. It used to be that if you played range, your damage uptimes were better along with your survivability, but your overall damage output was lower than stamina builds. Stamina builds required more skill to stay alive and maintain their damage output, but the damage ceiling was higher to make up for it. Each system suffers from the same major flaw. One playstyle will be highly preferred over the other in certain types of content. Back when damage checks were a much larger focus in boss design, higher damage builds were always preferable over high survivability ranged builds. It created a very competitive endgame scene that the devs didn't like, so they altered how they go about designing boss encounters so that survival and managing mechs were more important, but they also threw in lots of situations where bosses just don't allow you to be in melee range for large portions of the fight, so melee builds were no longer accepted into runs. This was a very low point, especially for Dragon Knights and Templars, as their entire kits were melee regardless of spec. Since then, they've sort of allowed power creep to nullify a lot of the challenge in older content that doesn't comply with their current sensibilities, effectively rendering damage checks pointless. And they've moved into this hybridization mindset that has ultimately destroyed any sense of distinction between builds, because once again, there will always be a preferred setup to each scenario, which will force people out of the playstyles they enjoy. For example, if your class does the highest amount of damage possible, but only if it's a hybrid, or only if it's a magicka build, or only if it's a stamina build, you're better off just playing that specific spec than choosing whether you want the range and survivability of a magicka build or the high damage and high skill of a stamina build. Every group now also needs like one Elemental Catalyst Necromancer and one Zen's Redress Alkosh Dragon Knight. Almost every group wants a DK tank because of Magma Shell. Almost every group wants one Warden Healer for the toughness buff. And with how every class is just being made more complicated to play and how there's so many sets with micromanagement to utilize effectively, you end up having people who used to main other classes like Magdans, F up in chat, or Dragon Knights, or basically any stamina spec, just swapping to Arcanist because they do so much damage and it's so fucking easy to play. Day one with my Magicka Arcanist, and I was already hitting 6-digit parses right at the same peak as my Stamblade that I have played since launch, which took me forever to master. Couple all of these PvE complaints with the fact that they've removed the amazing rewards we used to get for really difficult achievements like Challenger, and suddenly there's no incentive to struggle with the obtuse and overly complicated endgame meta anymore. I'm willing to bet that there are less people running endgame content consistently than ever before. Proportionally, of course, I know player numbers change. And I know one person did comment on the last video that you can run any content with any gear setup. That my complaints were only an optimizer's issue. But that's just not the case. The thing is that while you can run any content with any gear setup, basically any gear setup that's suited for your class and spec will be able to take you to endgame content. The problem is that you can't do trials alone. So finding a group who's willing to take you when you're running something so out of the ordinary is really difficult. And on top of that, if you have an entire team composition that doesn't support each other, you're not going to get those clears in PvE. And while I think that inherently this isn't a bad thing, having more of a focus on building team compositions that complement one another is a really good thing for the health of the game and the health of the community. The problem is that because it's so complicated, it's easier to just go to an Alcast page or go to the tanking website and just look at the builds that they recommend there and just copy paste. It doesn't require a fucking college degree in order to pull off. Now, moving away from current issues, I want to focus back on things for the future again and mention some stuff I sort of left out before. One thing I was hesitant to mention before because I know it's a bit more contentious is classes. It's no secret that most people had come to expect a new class every other year and were disappointed when ZOS deviated from that pattern. ESO is turning 10 this year and has 6 total classes to choose from. Granted, unlike other MMOs, the classes aren't forced to play as only a tank or only a healer or only a DPS. Build diversity does kind of exist in that sense for ESO, but let's go ahead and compare it with other non-equivalent games just for fun anyways. Final Fantasy XIV turns 11 this year and has 20 jobs, their version of classes basically, to choose from. To my understanding though, these do tend to be relegated to only serving a certain purpose, as well as only having access to certain weapons. Black Desert turns 10 this year and has 27 classes. Each class has a preset weapon, preset race, and preset gender. BDO does also not have the typical tank, healer, DPS roles, as group content is mostly overland and not really dungeon focused. Warframe is turning 11 this year and is about to hit 56 playable frames, not including primes, as they are functionally the same. Warframe does have way fewer skills per playable character and doesn't have the tank, DPS, healer categories anymore. It's mostly support and damage, but mostly everybody needs to have their own ability to tank a lot of damage. That said, the vast majority of frames feel completely unique in how you approach building them, playing them, and engaging with various content types. All this to say that I think it's perfectly fair to want more classes in an RPG-style game, and I number myself among the many that do. Once again, I recognize that balance is a major factor, which is what makes this topic so contentious, but I also, again, must point out that what was the point of establishing a baseline power for all skills of different types if not to ease the process of balancing new skills and preventing extreme impacts on the meta of the game? I know the devs also claim that it's sometimes quite a challenge to come up with new ideas for skills and gear set abilities, especially as more and more content gets released. I sort of addressed this in my previous video, but I would say again that there is so much lore in the Elder Scrolls universe that I just don't buy this excuse. Yeah, you may already have ice, fire, and lightning represented by the class system, but why not expand with new damage types like I mentioned before? People want a bard class or a monk class, so why not do as you've always done and put an Elder Scrolls spin on a classic RPG archetype? Maybe expand on the Moonsinger's lore and have a class themed around that. Use it as a way to fuse bards and monks into one. By the way, though, that idea is not my own. It came from a friend who goes by Bargain Price on Twitter. She's a fantastic artist and an avid player of ESO with many of the same frustrations I've expressed here. While on the subject of classes and skills, I want to highlight another notable omission from the last video, which I simply forgot to include, and that's new weapon types. Current weapon types with skill lines are one-handed shield, two-handed, dual-wield, bow, destruction staff, and restoration staff, with no new weapon types ever being added. As it stands, we have melee and ranged stamina-based weapons, but only ranged magicka-based weapons. Having a magicka-based melee weapon would be awesome. Polearms would be awesome. An unarmed skill line would be awesome, and especially tie in well with a monk class. And it's strange to see it omitted, as it's a staple of Elder Scrolls games of the past. Again, this is one of those areas where they could expand and improve upon the traditional Elder Scrolls formula. I know one challenge with doing that would be to having to implement new arena weapons for any new weapon types that exist, and it would also dilute the loot pool a bit. But, of course, they already have this curating system in place that could mitigate this. To add on to this, and to address a major complaint I see in the community, I think it's important to discuss this game's monetization structure. On the whole, and largely compared to other games I've played, the monetization in this game has a lot of good things going for it. Now, before you get your pitchforks out, I also do have a ton of issues with it. I think that absolutely under no circumstances should playable classes ever be paywalled. I think that the game's core experience should be available from the start, especially in a game that is buy to play. Is this game expensive? Yeah, not anymore. Does it come with a lot of content? Sure. But its core focus is combat, and classes are a major part of that experience. It shouldn't be paywalled, especially when you consider how strong Arcanist is right now. I understand the need to make money to pay employees to continue to work on the game and to also support an extremely expensive type of game, but if the game is accessible and caters to new players as well as veterans, it'll make its money back. I think more dev teams should be looking to Helldivers 2 or Warframe as an example of good monetization. No content in those games is paywalled, especially in Warframe. No frames, no mods, no weapons are ever paywalled. Premium currency is directly tradable in Warframe, and of course there's those weird Prime Resurgence things that, if I recall correctly, aren't tradable, but they are such a niche thing that I think it's probably fine. I think most people can agree that the whole concept of most new cosmetics, and particularly interesting ones, being crammed into these gambling-based money vampire crates is a bad look and should probably be reworked. Yeah, I know that Seals of Endeavor exist, but grinding them is fundamentally pointless. The prices are completely absurd compared to crown gems, and this game in general needs to do a lot more to incentivize people to play regularly and especially play together. Elder Scrolls Online promotes such an insanely selfish way of playing that it's no wonder groups feel like exclusive clubs unless you're the most moldable piece of clay without any identity of your own except for the one they tell you to have. New players to this game often feel instantly alienated by the game's lack of access to a simple understanding of its functions, goals, and ways to engage with it. I understand entirely that being new to a 10-year-old MMO is going to come with a pretty steep learning curve in most cases, but when that is coupled with the fact that veteran players are so heavily incentivized to keep to themselves, stay within their comfort zones, and not have any reason to welcome in new people who are less experienced, less skilled, and not using the latest and greatest builds, you've basically created this extremely unwelcoming isolationist, in-crowd atmosphere that's sure to scare off more people than it attracts. It's already daunting to be building a game with an existing IP that runs so heavily counter to prior games in the series by necessity. Making it more complicated and less conducive to group play exacerbates that problem tenfold. This is often seen in how much focus has been placed on Zerg busting in PvP, reduced rewards the more people you invite to play with you, the insane lack of attention given to group support playstyles, and Imperial City. No, I'm serious. Go play Imperial City for a day and see just how selfish and screwed up this game's culture can be. A disclaimer here, though, I actually love Imperial City and I do it all the time, but I actively avoid engaging with people there as much as I can. And before I round this video out, I'd like to mention a couple more things very quickly to not drag this out even longer. Dueling needs some love in ESO. We need to be able to set up dueling rule sets so that we can test out the various PvP types that exist. Give us the ability to toggle champion points, proc sets, or even set up teams so that we can test out group strategies before diving into Cyrodiil or Battlegrounds. The other thing I want to mention is overland content and questing. I hear all the time that overland content and quest content are too easy, that it's laughable that you can topple the Grey Host solo without breaking a sweat, but a simple lich in a 4-person dungeon requires a group. And I have to be honest, this is where my perspective on the game falters. I have never cared about overland content in most MMOs I've played, or quests for that matter. I don't think it would hurt the game at all to have optional difficulty sliders for stuff like this, but I also don't really think it benefits the game that much either. As far as I'm concerned, the primary focus of this game is dungeons, trials, and PvP. Those are what people seem to spend the majority of their time doing, and that really is the end game for ESO. Well, that and housing. Also, really funny that someone mentioned to me in the comments of the last video that there's an add-on for browsing furnishings. Like, obviously someone in the community would have made something like that, but it doesn't really help console players, does it? And besides, why would you not want it to be a native feature as long as it's robust and serviceable, unlike the advanced stats sheet? Anyways, that about wraps it up for this video. I feel like this one might be a bit more contentious overall than the last one, but I'm curious to see what all of you think, and I look forward to seeing more of your thoughts and feedback. As one final thought to close out this video, I need to say that I think the devs at ZeniMax actually do care about this game and its community. We certainly don't make it easy for them with all our whining and complaining and bickering, making shitty YouTube videos that jab at them all the time, or especially with the ridiculous fake outrage over stupid stuff like Maurmer implying certain uncouth things that YouTube probably doesn't want me mentioning. By the by, if you were one of the people outraged by that particular High Isle quest or whatever zone it was in, stop playing Elder Scrolls games. Our main antagonist is literally the god of the R word that rhymes with grape. I find it extremely unusual for people to be upset about that, but make no mention of the LeMay Ball quest, for fuck's sake. And if you were asking for a trigger warning, I will point you to the box where it says it's M for mature and it tells you why it's M for mature. Sorry, I just really needed to get that off my chest. That's it from me. I still really appreciate all of you, and I look forward to seeing you again in the future. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you next time.